Hey everybody, welcome to DadsDen of Pop Culture. And yes, talking about Archie again, but this time I'm talking about an interesting little bit of Archie lore. In 1964, Screen Gems produced a pilot for ABC for something that seemed probably like a no-brainer, a live-action take on Archie Andrews, star of the very popular Archie comics. How could it miss as a primetime TV sitcom? Well, Screen Gems, the TV arm of Columbia Pictures, had a pretty good track record with shows, with sitcom hits like Father Knows Best, The Donna Reed Show, Dennis the Menace, which was, of course, another transplant from comics, Hazel, and Bewitched, prior to their attempt at an Archie series. Gidget, I Dream a Genie, and the Monkees would soon follow. The episode was titled The Electric Cupid, and it was directed by Gene Nelson. Gene Nelson was an acclaimed dancer, actor, choreographer, screenwriter, and director, a Hollywood staple of musicals. By the time he worked on this pilot, he had directed Hand of Death in 1962 and Hoot Nanny Hoot. You can't say he didn't have range. That was in 1963. In 1964, he would direct the Elvis film Kissin' Cousins and the Hank Williams biopic Your Cheatin' Heart. Now, this wasn't Archie's first attempt to break into television. In 1962, Desilu Productions shot a pilot called Life with Archie that starred, of all people, Frank Bank, famous as Lumpy Rutherford on Leave It to Beaver. This pilot seems lost to time, but Frank Bank, said in interviews that sponsors took one look and figured audiences would never see past Lumpy. And let's be honest, I don't think anyone ever looked at Lumpy and thought, damn, that guy would be the perfect Archie Andrews. Well, after the 64 pilot also fizzled, Filmation finally found success with the Archie Show cartoon in 1968 on CBS. It was a Saturday morning smash, helped boost sales of the comic book, just as Adam West's Batman had with the Batman comics, and later expanded into the Archie Comedy Hour and famously spawned the #1 Billboard hit Sugar Sugar in 1969, sold 1 million copies and became one of the biggest bubblegum pop hits ever. By 1964, Archie comics were a well-oiled machine, churning out wholesome teen humor that kids could not get enough of. The flagship title, Archie, was selling over 480,000 copies per issue, and titles like Betty and Veronica and Life with Archie weren't too far behind. The full lineup also included Archie's pal Jughead, Archie's joke book, Pep Comics. It was an empire. With that built-in audience, putting Archie on TV made perfect sense. But apparently not with ABC's executives. The pilot starred John Simpson as Archie Andrews. This would have been his first major role. He would go on to have a small zombie part, literally, in Night of the Living Dead, and then he became a math teacher. The show seems to draw on the idea that Archie was a really wholesome comic, and it was mostly, but it also was about, a high school kid in a love triangle with a couple pinup models who were supposed to also be in high school. Archie often had a wry sense of humor, and you don't really get a whole lot of that in the pilot. I think this has more to do with the script than it does, say, with Simpson, although watching him, I don't get the feeling he had a whole lot of edge that he was going to bring to any role that he was in. But I haven't really seen him as the zombie, so I can't say that for sure. Betty Cooper was played by Cheryl Holdridge, returning from the 1962 pilot. Cheryl was a former Mouseketeer with a lot of TV credits, including a couple Screen Gems shows like Dennis the Menace and The Donna Reed Show. She's really great as the girl next door, very sweet, very pretty, though again, Betty Cooper could get pretty ticked off at Veronica, so, are we going to see a little bit of that fire in her? Well, we'll see. Veronica Lodge was played by Mickey Jamison, who had some TV credits and a couple American International Beach or beach-adjacent movies. Honestly, Veronica and Betty are both very good castings in this show. I think they did a good job with both actresses. Reggie Mantle was played by Wayne Adams. They went a little bit more for the jock angle with Reggie, which is kind of understandable. It's an archetype that would have been familiar to a lot of people back then, but maybe not exactly right for the character. Archie's dad, Fred Andrews, was played by William Schallert, veteran of just so many TV shows, I won't even try to mention them. It would probably make this video an hour long. Most interesting, though, is that one of those credits overlaps with this one. He was already playing Martin Lane on The Patty Duke Show. Now, how would this have worked if the Archie pilot had been picked up? Well, stay tuned. In the pilot, Fred is a psychologist as opposed to a businessman, as in the comics. We get talk about the generation gap early on. so maybe they wanted to lean into those sorts of stories. Gidget would do something similar, although I think they did a better job of kind of keeping it real between Gidget and her dad than they did here. Mary Andrews, Archie's dear mom, was played by Jean Vander, Pyle, most famously the voice of Wilma Flintstone, but also the original voice of Margaret Anderson on the original Father Knows Best radio show. Actually, a pretty good resemblance to the comic character, so another decent bit of casting. Of course, you couldn't have high school hijinks without Mr. Weatherby, the Bee, Archie's principal and often his nemesis. He's played by Roland Winters, who played Elvis's long-suffering dad in Blue Hawaii extremely well. Winters does not necessarily look a lot like the comic book principal, but I think he was a solid choice to play him. The guy had a really good bellow when he was angry. Miss Grundy is played by Mary Grace Canfield, of course best known from Green Acres. Again, doesn't look a ton like the comic book character, but I think she's a pretty good casting for the role, given what they wanted to do with it. And then there's Jughead Jones. Here's where the real problem, in my opinion, creeps in. Jughead is played by Jerry Bright, and I have no problem with the casting or his acting, but the characterization is all wrong. Now, first, we don't have the Jughead hat right off the bat. I know in that day and age, kids didn't wear those hats, but Jughead did, and Jughead not keeping up with fashion trends is actually key to his character. In the comics, Jughead might be the only character in Riverdale you could actually describe as cool, as in Jughead does what Jughead likes, and he doesn't care what anybody else thinks. He's the voice of sarcastic reason in Archie's adventures, the one guy not chasing clout and girls in Riverdale. In the pilot, though, he's kind of just a little sidekick for Archie, just agrees with everything he says, well, pretty much. Not really that much, pep or spirit to the character. Really not Jughead. Now, this might have had a bigger impact on the pilot's rejection than you might imagine. The episode opens at the Andrews house one morning. Fred and Mary are at breakfast, wondering why Archie is still sleeping upstairs. Plenty of tropes here, and not too different from the comics or a dozen other sitcoms involving teenage kids. Now, here's where they introduce the idea that Archie was an inventor, lots of crazy gadgets, the Ferris Bueller of his day. This wasn't really a trope in the comics, although I'm sure they did it at some point because Archie's ran since 1941, but I suppose they thought it would lend itself to sight gags and comic plots in the TV show. Archie winds up getting sent to the principal in the episode by Miss Grundy. He stops to chat with Weatherby's secretary, Miss Kinney, and he overhears Mr. Weatherby dealing with a PTA member, who also happens to be Mrs. Drysdale, complaining about the upcoming school dance, that there are too many shy kids who are sitting out these dances. Now, Weatherby thinks that that's their prerogative, but she disagrees. She wants all the kids to have dates and to attend. You get the idea. So Archie concocts a scheme, partly maybe to get out of trouble, to use Mr. Lodge's new electric brain that he has at the bank to match everyone with perfect dates. Archie is a little bit more of a dreamer in this show than in the comics, I think, more ambitious. Comic Archie seems like he's trying to survive school and his parents, with his main focus being on Veronica and, to a lesser extent, Betty. Here, he's really, like I said, more like a Ferris Bueller, kind of ambitious, has big ideas, things that he wants to accomplish. Now, Jughead, by the way, when Miss Grundy announced the dance in class, immediately asked the girl for a date. Again, that isn't Jughead. This dude is almost the anti-Jughead. Archie, Betty, Veronica, and Jughead end up holding a big rally to hand out punch cards to all the kids, asking about their height, their weight, their hobbies, their likes and dislikes, basically computer dating, which shows up a lot in old sitcoms at this time. The aim is to get the bashful kids to the dance. Nobody's more bashful than Mildred. She takes a card from Archie, but then runs off, just too embarrassed by the whole thing. And here we get a very Veronica thing out of Veronica. Essentially blackmail. If you want to use the computer, Archie, you're going to have to break your date with Betty for the dance and go with me instead. Now, Archie feels responsibility towards all these kids that he's promised to get dates. He really needs to use that computer, so he does it. And Betty gives him a smack. He chases after her. She tells him that she loved him before his voice even changed, which is quite lore accurate for Archie. Well, Reggie shows up then and does a very Reggie thing. tells Veronica that he overheard Archie telling Betty he was just going along until he used the computer. Then he was dropping Veronica and going with Betty because, of course, Reggie wants to take Veronica to the dance. The result, of course, is that Archie gets his second smack of the day from Veronica, and he doesn't get to use the computer. So, that Friday afternoon in the gym, the big chunky electronic brain is supposed to spit out pairings for the Get Acquainted party, with Jughead secretly inside making the matches himself. I think we get a brief moment of Linda Kay Hinning here, Betty Jo on Petticoat Junction, which also premiered in late 1963. So again, unlikely that she would be in a pilot in a very minor role when she was already in a starring role in a sitcom. Again, more on that in a moment. Oh, and we do get Jughead's hat here while Weatherby is yelling at Archie, so that was a relief. Archie and Weatherby have this sort of Hogan-Colonel Klink relationship in this pilot. Well, on dance night, the boy genius doesn't have Betty or Veronica or anybody, but he discovers that Mildred was too bashful to turn her card in, so she doesn't have a date either. And in the end, there's a wholesome resolution, and everyone has fun at the dance. All in all, it's not a bad Archie-style plot. Like I said, Archie comics were essentially a sitcom already, with some slapstick, not enough of that in the show, some bad jokes and puns, and good girl art. It should have lent itself to being a TV sitcom very readily. So why didn't it get picked up by ABC? Well, we probably will never know for sure, but it did already have some stiff competition on TV. The Patty Duke Show was pulling good Nielsen ratings, hitting the top 20 in its first season, and The Many Loves of Dobie Gillis was already a solid success. Gidget would show up, I think, a year after, and although it struggled, it did so because it was up against the Beverly Hillbillies and the Virginian. It still became a hit with teenagers. The pilot with the electric brain was kind of timely, but it lacked some of the comedic energy of a typical Archie comic from the 60s, and the energy that you got on the shows that it was going to be in competition with. It was maybe a little bit too wholesome and a little bit too safe. You don't have that comeuppance you often get at the end of an Archie strip. Mr. Lodge throwing Archie out of his mansion, a sarcastic Jughead roasting everyone, wild slapstick. Archie had all of that stuff in the 1960s, so it really should have made it into the pilot and really didn't. As a result, I think it felt more like a show for younger kids than for teenagers, and perhaps younger kids were actually a big component of Archie's fan base, but they weren't enough to merit a primetime TV show. So ABC passed, and Riverdale's gang would have to wait a few more years before it found success on the small screen. But then there is still that question. Was this a 1964 pilot with two people in it who were already on hit shows? I think it's likely that this was actually a pilot that was filmed in 1963 in the summer, maybe just about a year after they tried the other one with Frank Banks. That's why those two are in it. Schallert was also in another pilot in 63 called Filbert, which is actually pretty interesting. You can find it on YouTube. You might want to check it out. So that's my guess, is that they were already, Patty Duke hadn't been picked up yet. So he had probably done pilots for that, for Filbert, for this, maybe something else, because he was a working actor trying to get on a series. So that's my guess. I have a feeling it actually maybe aired in 64, probably as a special, but was actually made in 1963. But when it comes down to it, I think it's actually a pretty decent little pilot, and I think it showed a lot of potential. Just needed a little more oomph if it was going to turn into a classic 1960s sitcom. Let me know what you think in the comments. I would love to hear from you about good old Archie Andrews. If you enjoyed this little review, please give it a like, maybe subscribe, maybe share with a friend. That would be very cool. But until next time, God bless everybody. Please be kind to one another. Have a little bit of fun out there. Watch the Archie pilot. You can find it on YouTube. It's not the greatest copy in the world, but it gives you the basic idea. I will see you hopefully again soon in Dad's Den of Pop Culture. Bye-bye.